This is a paper that we wrote because there's a lot of labor law changes occurring around the world, and many of them have common themes. So my co-author, Anna, who's not here, she is the lawyer in this team, and I feel a little bit intimidated by the legal scholar power in this room because I'm not from law, and so if I make some mistakes here, the mistakes are entirely mine. Okay, let me just say that there is a dynamic behind labor policy reform today, and this paper is really a very simple idea, but you know, the most powerful ideas are simple, right? What I want to share with you is how we see the labor reform process unfolding before us today. And we've just had one in Ontario last week, so it gives me some ammunition here to add to my paper. And we've had a major labor law reform round in Brazil last year, and the government is about to change, actually tomorrow, because they have the final round of the presidential election. The new government will not undo any of it. In fact, they will add on more in the same direction. So we'll not see a reversal, as we are saying in Ontario. So this is something you all know, that, and I think Leah has written extensively about this, that our current policy regime is really structured around the concept of employment, and more specifically standard employment. And the situation we are in now is that there is a kind of mismatch between the way we regulate and the way the market is today. So this calls for a closer look. If you watch late night comedy, Seth Meyers does. Now this calls for a closer look. So I'm going to give you my 30-second history of labor regulation as I see it. So we had very early on a private relationship, no public interest. But by the 1910s, and you know, the Canadian IDI Act is a good example. They said, well, there's too much conflict. We got to control, contain, and manage this conflict. So that became the policy focus. Then under New Deal, it was revisited, and this idea emerged that just controlling conflict is not enough. You got to balance the rights of workers and employers. And then come the 1980s, where in the Reagan-Thatcher era, we started saying, and I remember some of our CIRA meetings and Gilles addressing this topic, say, look, it's just not about balancing the rights. Is labor law doing anything to create prosperity in society? We need jobs, we need investment. And this argument was perverted during that era by this causal chart I'm showing you at the bottom. And the argument was, let's deregulate labor. We have too much regulations. This will lower costs, and the lower costs will stimulate economic growth and investment, and we'll have more jobs, and we'll have prosperity. Sadly, that was a false promise, and the prophets of that era have been resoundingly proven wrong, because even in the world's most successful economy, among the large and prosperous ones, the US, it is true that they have created jobs, but when you look at the nature of those jobs, you get another story. So today, conflict containment is not enough. I mean, basically, the argument is, and just balancing the rights is not enough. And of course, this deregulation story didn't pan out. So where are we today, and what kind of paradigm that we should build around labor regulation or labor reform? So my contention to you is that what we need to do is to redefine the goal of labor policy. It's not just worker protection, which is certainly part of it, but it's more than that. And it should really be asking the question, do we stimulate economic growth And does that convert into social progress? So we want both. Today it's not this or that, it's not left or right, but we need smart policies that can do both for us. And of course, since I teach human resources, I have to say that you got to invest in people if you really want this to go forward. So the idea of smart regulation is very simple. It is that we should go back to, in accounting, this is known as zero-based budgeting. You do not build your budget this year based on what it was last year and argue about increase or decrease, which is what we do in labor regulation today. Should we regulate more or should we deregulate? It's a unidimensional spectrum. You either go forward or you go back. But rather, take the example, it's just at the bottom, if you can see it, is my favorite example is Uber. And not every jurisdiction in the world, but some jurisdictions in the world have said that Uber is disruptive, but it calls for revisiting regulations. And in some cities, Uber has to meet more regulations because it was totally unregulated. But the taxi industry that was over-regulated has to deregulate. So there is one set of rules for everyone. And so in a way that helps me to illustrate the idea. So when we sit down for labor policy reform, we cannot say that everything that's on the books is sacrosanct and we cannot touch it, we cannot go back there. So the argument that is very interesting, I think, for those of you who are from economics, from political economy, and from labor relations, is let's ask if labor regulations appropriately designed can be a significant policy tool to stimulate social and economic development. And I have bad news for you. There's nothing in the economics literature to date that says that a totally unregulated economy will underperform a appropriately regulated economy. And I think we need to see more research in this area that would foster this argument. So one good example, my favorite example, is minimum wage regulation. When we change minimum wages, we are focused on what will this do tomorrow, what will this do next year? And we get into this debate about if you increase minimum wages, some people would lose their jobs. If you want to create jobs, you got to reduce minimum wages. This has happened last Friday in Ontario, where they're rolling back the next scheduled increase. They're freezing the minimum wage for 33 months, which will essentially amount to taking us back to where we were in 2013 when the last legal changes were made. But on the other hand, look at the long-term effect of minimum wages. And there what we find is that every economy in the world, whether it's advanced economy or emerging economy, increases in minimum wages are positively associated with economic growth and job creation, not negatively. So what's happening there? Well, if you unpack that story, what you find that as you increase minimum wages over the years, business starts to adapt to it. They anticipate that this floor is keep rising. And so they start to automate simple operations. They start to export some of those jobs. It's not politically correct for me to say that, but if you compare Canada 1950 and Canada 2010, you can clearly see that many jobs that we had in the 50s or 60s are no longer here. And that is intimately tied to the fact that we have a much higher minimum wage today. So what happened to the people? Well, we invested in training and education and in skills. So people learned new skills and they moved on. Not always the same people, but certainly the coming generations. And so we have been forced to innovate, improve our productivity, create jobs, and Canada has not lacked, I would argue, in attracting new investment as a country. So another problem with this debate is that often we reduce it to a micro level where we say, you know, there's a mom and pop shop on the corner. If you increase the minimum wage, this guy is going to go out of business. And that's how you make decisions, but that's the wrong level to look at. Okay, just briefly, I want to spend a few minutes on Brazil, and I have 3 minutes left. So in the Bill 148, this is the Ontario bill. Rest in peace. It was born December 17. Did not live very long, and is going to die now. So just to take a couple of examples. Equal pay for equal work. So because of the increasing precariousness in the labor market, the last round of reform said that you cannot discriminate on the basis of employment status. If you hire a part-time worker and a full-time worker, but if they are doing the same job, that is, their productivity is the same, they have the same skills, same productivity, you cannot pay them less. And in fact, you know, for years I have thought that this is a legally sanctioned discrimination, which is entirely unfair, unjustified. So the last government tried to right this wrong, and it's very important because so many people now have non-standard jobs. But this round now is going to repeal that provision. Now think again about what I said about the goal of labor policy is to create prosperity, to create jobs. Are you going to move us towards prosperity if you lock a section of your labor force into low-skill, low-paying jobs, occupations? Because there's no incentive for the employers to go back and improve productivity, to innovate. So this is also a poverty trap, I would argue. And maybe people in this room don't feel it, but it's very real now in Ontario for at least 15% of the workforce. So we are kind of reinventing the Roman slavery system, where by law we are trapping a segment of our workforce into this perpetuity. And just one other example is the fines for violating employment standards were increased in the last round to $5,000 for individuals and $100,000 for organizations. And this repeal will put it back. Now imagine these numbers were set 20, 30 years ago. There's inflation. And basically the government is saying to businesses that, you know, go ahead, violate the law. If you get caught, you'll pay a small fee. So this is a nod. It's not explicit, but it's a nod to business to go ahead and violate. Okay, now a couple of minutes on I know my time is up. Okay, about Brazil. So Brazil passed a law last year, and it does several very bad things from this lens that I'm sharing with you in terms of creating prosperity. So they have a provision called in pages, which basically says that if parties agree among themselves to lower labor standards below that provided by the law, then it's okay. It's not even a nod. This is a carte blanche. Now, it is limited to certain items. It doesn't apply to minimum wage, but it applies to hours of work, unemployment insurance, telework, zero-hour contracts, and get this, safety and health standards, which is the most shocking. Okay, my time is up. So these are the areas where they have deregulated. And the last one I want to just say is the system of union representation. So Brazil had this constitutional provision that everyone has to join a union, and the employer must deduct dues and pay directly to the union. And that was the basis for the Brazilian labor movement. Now, this law says employers don't have to deduct the dues and pay.
Right to work. Right to
So
work.
it's a kind of right to work, but not completely. And I'll tell you in a
Taxes.
yeah, but Brazilian unions had become very unrepresentative and unaccountable to membership because they could just get this money. So really the current unions are going to die because they have to now form unions that have a strong workplace presence, because their system had become aloof, it's disconnected from the workplace. They only did collective bargaining, and only at a very high level, very centralized level. In any case, my time is up, so thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I can add further.
Thank you.